What happens when a city is nearly wiped off the map? Most towns would never recover. But Seattle? It turned disaster into opportunity. Seattle sits in the Pacific Northwest, perched between Puget Sound to the west and Lake Washington to the east. Today, it feels like a city of glass, steel, and innovation. But rewind the clock, and you'll find land shaped by glaciers, rain, and a resilient people who had lived there for thousands of years before anyone dreamed of calling it Seattle. Why does this history matter? Because you can't understand the tech giant Seattle has become without tracing the roots that lie deep in cedar forests, tribal villages, and a fragile frontier settlement that teetered on collapse more than once. So let's go back to the very beginning, long before skyscrapers, before coffee shops, before Boeing jets. Long before Europeans arrived, the land we know as Seattle was home to the Coast Salish peoples. Among them were the Duwamish, Suquamish, and other related tribes. Their world was shaped by water. Rivers and lakes carved their homeland, and the sea provided salmon, clams, and seals. Cedar trees gave them canoes, homes, clothing, and tools. Life here wasn't random survival. It was ordered, intentional, and rich with tradition. Villages lined the shores of Elliott Bay and the Duwamish River. Longhouses held extended families. Trade networks stretched far beyond the Puget Sound, connecting communities across the Pacific Northwest. One figure in this world stands out, Seattle, later known as Chief Seattle. Born around 1786, Seattle was a leader of both the Suquamish and Duwamish peoples. By the time settlers arrived, he was already a respected diplomat and strategist. He understood that change was coming and that survival would depend on how his people adapted. But here's something that's rarely told. When settlers first came, the Duwamish didn't resist with violence. They extended a hand of welcome. That choice would shape Seattle's survival. In the fall of 1851, a small group of settlers, led by Arthur Denny, arrived by ship at Alki Point. They were part of a larger westward migration, men and women who had crossed the continent seeking new lives. They brought with them ambition, determination, and the belief that this land could become their future. But almost immediately, they realized the harsh truth. Alki Point was exposed to brutal weather. The soil was poor, and the tide made docking difficult. Within months, they began looking for a better site. With the help of local tribes, they relocated across Elliott Bay to a more sheltered area, rich in timber and easier to access by water. This muddy shoreline would become the heart of Seattle. Without indigenous knowledge, the settlers might not have lasted the first year. They leaned on local tribes for food, guidance, and safe passage. When the settlers staked their claim to this new settlement, they needed a name. They chose to honor Chief Seattle, anglicized as Seattle. Why? Partly out of respect. Chief Seattle had built relationships with settlers, urging cooperation rather than conflict. But it was also pragmatic. The settlers hoped that naming the town after him would ensure goodwill and reduce hostilities. This wasn't just symbolic. Chief Seattle gave speeches reminding both his people and the newcomers that coexistence was possible. Though chiltered through translation and retelling, his message was clear. The land was sacred, and its future would belong to both peoples, whether they liked it or not. The settlers needed a way to survive and to thrive. They found it in the massive forests surrounding them. Towering Douglas firs and western red cedars became Seattle's first currency. By the mid-1850s, Henry Yesler, one of Seattle's early leaders, built a steam-powered sawmill on the waterfront. This was revolutionary. The sawmill became the heart of the economy, drawing workers, traders, and fortune seekers. Lumber was shipped out by boat to San Francisco, where a booming post-gold rush city devoured wood for construction. Seattle wasn't a polished city. It was a rough logging camp where mud, sawdust, and stumps defined the landscape. But that sawmill was the seed. Without it, Seattle may never have grown at all. But let's not romanticize this period. The peace between settlers and indigenous peoples was fragile. As more settlers arrived, they claimed land that had been native territory for centuries. Treaties were signed, but not always honored. In 1855, Governor Isaac Stevens pushed for treaties that forced tribes to cede vast amounts of land while moving on to reservations. The Duwamish, Suquamish, and others signed under pressure, but resentment brewed. The result? The Puget Sound War of 1855 to 1856. Raids, skirmishes, and mistrust spread across the region. In January 1856, Seattle itself came under attack. A force of native warriors assaulted the settlement, but settlers, supported by a U.S. Navy ship anchored in the bay, held them off. The Battle of Seattle lasted a single day, but its impact was lasting. The uneasy alliance between settlers and tribes broke apart. Trust was gone. From that point forward, native peoples were systematically pushed aside, their presence diminished in the growing city that bore their chief's name. After the battle, many believed Seattle might fail. Other nearby towns, like Olympia and Port Townsend, seemed better positioned for success. Seattle was muddy, isolated, and dependent on lumber. Seattle survived precisely because of its stubborn settlers. They refused to leave. They kept cutting timber, kept loading ships, and kept building homes. They drained swamps, cleared land, and pushed forward. By the late 1850s, the settlement had grown into a small but determined community. There was no guarantee of success. But something had been set in motion, a resilience that would become Seattle's defining trait. Here's a detail that rarely makes the history books. Life in early Seattle was brutal. Streets were knee-deep in mud. Houses leaned against tree stumps. Sanitation was non-existent. People battled disease, accidents, and isolation. And yet, there was also camaraderie. Families built together, shared food, and looked out for one another. They dreamed of a future city, even when survival seemed doubtful. These forgotten stories remind us, Seattle wasn't inevitable. It was fragile, precarious, and dependent on the sheer will of its people to endure. If there's one moment that defines Seattle's early birth, it's the establishment of Yesler's sawmill. That steam-powered mill transformed a muddy clearing into an economic hub. It gave settlers a reason to stay, traders a reason to come, and ships a reason to dock. Seattle was no longer just a camp. It was becoming a city. Seattle wasn't just fighting against fire. It was battling rival cities, greedy railroads, and its own muddy foundations. By the end of the 19th century, what began as a rough logging outpost had faced down annihilation more than once, and each time it clawed its way back stronger. Seattle in the 1860s and 1870s wasn't the metropolis we know today. It was still small, fragile, and overshadowed by older settlements like Olympia, Port Townsend, and Tacoma. If you had asked observers at the time which town would rise as the Northwest's great city, most wouldn't have bet on Seattle. But the fight for dominance was just beginning, and Seattle was about to learn that survival was only half the battle. Growth required boldness, luck, and reinvention. By the 1870s and 1880s, Seattle grew rapidly. Lumber remained the backbone of the economy, but coal mining added another source of wealth. Ships carried coal from Seattle's harbor to San Francisco and beyond. Immigrants arrived too, drawn by jobs and opportunity. Chinese laborers in particular played a vital role, working in mills, mines, and on railroads. But growth came tension.
White workers, fearing competition, turned on the Chinese. In 1886, anti-Chinese riots erupted in Seattle, part of a wave of violence that spread across the West Coast. A mob attempted to expel Chinese residents, loading them onto ships by force. It was one of Seattle's darkest episodes. Federal troops were called in to restore order, but the scars lingered. This was the other side of Seattle's early boom: progress mixed with prejudice, prosperity shadowed by injustice.
By the late 1880s, Seattle had grown into a bustling town of more than 25,000 residents, but almost everything was built of wood: houses, sidewalks, warehouses, even sewers. Lumber defined Seattle, but it also made it a tinderbox. And then, in 1889, disaster struck. On June 6, 1889, a glue pot overturned in a carpentry shop on Front Street. Flames spread quickly, igniting sawdust, resin, and wooden buildings. Within minutes, fire roared through the city. Seattle had no professional fire department, only volunteers. Water pressure was weak, hoses leaked, and hydrants ran dry. The blaze leapt from building to building, consuming blocks at terrifying speed. By the time it was over, 25 city blocks lay in ruins. The entire business district was gone. Seattle was devastated. Thousands were left homeless. Businesses were wiped out. It looked as if the city's fragile rise had been erased in a single afternoon. The fire, as destructive as it was, became the turning point Seattle needed. Rather than abandon the city, Seattle's citizens rebuilt with astonishing speed. Within days, businesses set up shop in tents. Within weeks, reconstruction began. This time, they built differently. The city passed ordinances requiring brick and stone for new downtown buildings. Streets were widened, sewers upgraded, and sidewalks rebuilt in safer, sturdier materials. And then came one of the boldest projects in Seattle's history: razing the city itself. Because the fire had destroyed so much, engineers saw a chance to fix a long-standing problem: Seattle's swampy, uneven ground. They began regrading streets, raising building foundations, and constructing new sidewalks above the old level. The result was an underground city beneath the new one: dark passageways and storefronts abandoned below street level. Today, you can still tour parts of this Seattle underground, a ghostly reminder of a city literally built on its own ruins. The fire could have ended Seattle. Instead, it transformed it, forcing modernization and laying the foundation for a stronger future. Seattle was rebuilt, but it still lagged behind Portland and Tacoma. The city needed a break, something to propel it onto the national stage. That break came in 1897, when the steamship Portland arrived in Seattle from Alaska carrying a ton of gold. News spread like wildfire. The Klondike gold rush had begun. Seattle seized the opportunity with ruthless efficiency. City leaders branded Seattle as the gateway to Alaska. They marketed it aggressively, convincing prospectors that Seattle was the place to buy supplies, board ships, and launch expeditions north. Outfitters, merchants, and shipbuilders cashed in. The city boomed as thousands of fortune seekers poured through, spending money on gear, passage, and entertainment. Most of those prospectors never found gold, but Seattle did. The city grew wealthy not by mining the Klondike, but by outfitting those who tried. The population soared. Banks, hotels, and theaters sprang up. Newspapers exploded with stories of wealth and adventure. Seattle had finally outpaced its rivals, transforming from a struggling town into a major city. By the dawn of the 20th century, Seattle had risen from logging camp to regional powerhouse. It had faced down rivals, rebuilt after fire, and ridden the wave of the gold rush. But it wasn't just wealth that defined this new Seattle. It was confidence.
The city had proven it could fight back from setbacks and turn adversity into strength. Yet beneath the optimism, problems remained. Labor unrest, corruption, and social divides would challenge Seattle in the decades ahead. And as industry expanded, so too would be tensions between workers and employers, reformers and profiteers. But that's the story of another chapter. Seattle's turning point wasn't survival, it was reinvention. The fire destroyed the old wooden city, but from its ashes rose a brick and stone metropolis. The gold rush gave it wealth and national recognition. Rivalries pushed it to fight harder, innovate faster, and refuse defeat. This was no longer the fragile settlement of the 1850s. By 1900, Seattle had become a city ready to stand on the national stage. What if the very forces that fueled Seattle's explosive growth also threatened to tear it apart? The early 20th century brought booming industry, waves of migration, and unprecedented opportunity. But it also brought bitter strikes, violent clashes, and questions about whether Seattle could hold itself together. Out of this fragile, divided city emerged one of the most transformative companies in American history, Boeing. Seattle at the turn of the century was buzzing with new energy. The gold rush had put it on the map, but what came next would determine whether it could become more than a boomtown. The population had tripled in just 2 decades, surging past 200,000 by 1910. Immigrants from Scandinavia, Italy, Japan, and beyond arrived to work in mills, docks, and factories. Seattle was young, brash, and ambitious.
But beneath the surface, tensions brewed. Workers demanded fair wages and safer conditions, while business leaders fought to keep costs low and power concentrated. Seattle was about to become a battleground, not just for industries, but for the soul of the city itself. The Klondike gold rush ended as quickly as it had begun. By 1900, most prospectors had moved on, and the easy money was gone. Seattle needed new industries to sustain its momentum. Timber was still strong, but the forests could not last forever. Coal mining continued, but competition was fierce. City leaders knew that Seattle's future depended on diversifying. Shipbuilding became one answer. With its deep harbor and access to the Pacific, Seattle was perfectly positioned to build and repair vessels. Fishing, too, grew into a major industry, connecting Seattle to Alaska's salmon-rich waters. But growth brought new challenges: overcrowding, poor sanitation, housing shortages, and corruption. The gap between the wealthy and the working poor widened, setting the stage for conflict. By the early 20th century, Seattle was one of the most unionized cities in America. Lumber workers, dock workers, and teamsters banded together to fight for better conditions. But business leaders fought back, forming alliances to break strikes and weaken unions. Tensions erupted into open conflict. The most famous showdown came in 1919, during the Seattle General Strike. It began with a strike by shipyard workers who demanded wage increases after World War I. Their cause resonated across the city. Soon, more than 65,000 workers, from streetcar operators to restaurant staff, joined in solidarity. For 5 days, Seattle came to a standstill. Streetcars stopped running, shops closed, even barbers put down their scissors. Workers organized food kitchens, garbage collection, and essential services, determined to show that labor could run the city more fairly than business leaders. The strike was peaceful, but newspapers, politicians, and national figures branded it a Bolshevik uprising, stoking fears of revolution. The strike collapsed under pressure, and business leaders reasserted control. Yet the memory lingered. The general strike became a symbol, either of working-class solidarity or of dangerous radicalism, depending on who you asked. Seattle's labor wars had revealed a truth. The city's growth was fragile,
balanced on a knife's edge between cooperation and collapse. Ironically, it was war that temporarily steadied Seattle's growth. During World War I, demand for ships skyrocketed. Seattle's shipyards exploded with activity, employing tens of thousands of workers. The city became a crucial hub for naval construction. At its peak, Seattle shipyards turned out hundreds of vessels, fueling both the war effort and the local economy. But this boom carried risks. Workers were pushed harder, hours lengthened, and conditions worsened. When the war ended, demand for ships collapsed almost overnight. This sudden bust fed directly into the unrest that sparked the 1919 general strike. Growth in Seattle was never smooth. It was a roller coaster of boom and bust, prosperity and panic. Amid this chaos, one man saw opportunity in the skies. In 1916, William Boeing, a wealthy timberman with a fascination for aviation, built his first airplane, a seaplane called the B&W, after Boeing and his partner George Westervelt. Seattle may have been a city of lumber and ships, but Boeing envisioned something new, aircraft that could connect the world. His company, originally called Pacific Aero Products, soon became the Boeing Airplane Company. The first breakthrough came during World War I, when Boeing secured contracts to build military planes. Though modest at first, these contracts laid the foundation for a future empire. Boeing's company nearly failed after the war when demand collapsed, but instead of folding, Boeing pivoted. He built mail planes, passenger aircraft, and experimental designs, keeping the company alive through innovation. What started in a small boathouse on Lake Union would one day transform not just Seattle, but the global economy. While industries boomed, Seattle also gained a reputation for vice. Gambling dens, saloons, and brothels flourished in Pioneer Square. Corruption ran deep in city politics, with police and officials often turning a blind eye in exchange for bribes. Seattle was a city of contradictions. Moral reformers clashed with vice entrepreneurs, unionists with capitalists, immigrants with nativists. It was never a simple story of growth. It was always contested, always fragile. Seattle's growth also came from immigration. Scandinavians worked in fisheries and logging. Italians and Greeks built roads and worked on the docks. Japanese immigrants opened farms, hotels, and businesses, carving out vital roles in the local economy. But discrimination persisted. Laws restricted land ownership for Asian immigrants. Unions often excluded non-white workers. Racial tensions simmered beneath Seattle's growth. Yet despite the barriers, immigrant communities left lasting marks, building neighborhoods, churches, and businesses that remain part of Seattle's character today.
The story of early 20th century Seattle is one of contradiction. The city boomed with shipyards and aircraft factories, yet trembled with strikes and protests. It attracted immigrants and entrepreneurs, yet struggled with prejudice and corruption. And in the midst of all this, Boeing planted a seed that would grow into a global powerhouse. Seattle's growth was never inevitable. It was fragile, uncertain, and contested at every step. But through that fragility came resilience. Each crisis forced the city to reinvent itself, to adapt, and to push forward. What if the city that had survived fire, labor wars, and boom and bust cycles faced its darkest hour and emerged stronger than ever? Seattle in the 1930s teetered on the edge of collapse. Banks failed, jobs vanished, dreams evaporated overnight. But within a decade, the city would become a hub of wartime production, launching planes, ships, and technology that would transform the Pacific Northwest forever. Seattle's survival during this period wasn't just luck. It was a combination of resilience, bold leadership, and the indomitable spirit of its people. By the end of the 1920s, Seattle had matured into a bustling industrial city. Boeing was making airplanes, shipyards lined the waterfront, immigrant communities and labor unions had carved out influence. But the Great Depression threatened to unravel all of it. Seattle, like cities across America, faced unemployment, poverty, and despair. This period would test the city in ways it had never faced before. And, ironically, it was these same hardships that would prepare Seattle for its transformative role in World War II. The stock market crash of 1929 sent shockwaves across the nation. In Seattle, industry slowed almost overnight. Shipbuilding orders dried up. Logging demand collapsed. Even Boeing, still recovering from post-World War I cuts, faced uncertainty. Unemployment skyrocketed. Thousands of workers, many of them immigrants, were left without jobs. Bread lines and soup kitchens became a daily reality. The city's streets, once bustling with commerce, now held despair. Here's a fact few remember. Seattle's waterfront, the city's economic backbone, was eerily quiet during these years. Ships that once bristled with activity sat idle, rotting at the docks. City leaders scrambled. Federal programs like the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, and the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, provided relief jobs. New parks, roads, and public buildings sprang up, keeping people employed and restoring hope. Yet despite government aid, poverty persisted. Seattle's fragile growth from the gold rush and early industry seemed at risk of unraveling completely. Hard times reignited labor conflicts. Workers demanded jobs, wages, and relief. Strikes erupted across the city. The most significant came in the Seattle shipyard strikes of the early 1930s, as shipyard workers protested layoffs and pay cuts. Although less dramatic than the 1919 general strike, these strikes highlighted the fragile balance between labor and industry during economic collapse. Employers fought back fiercely. Violence occasionally flared, and police often sided with management. Yet these conflicts also strengthened unions, setting the stage for the stronger labor movements of the 1940s. Seattle was learning a hard lesson. Survival during hard times required solidarity, but also compromise. At its lowest point, Seattle's population was demoralized. Homelessness increased, migrants from other regions arrived in search of work, swelling the ranks of those living in makeshift camps along the waterfront and the city's parks. Yet beneath the despair, the city's industrial infrastructure remained intact. Factories, mills, and shipyards were intact. Skilled workers, engineers, and entrepreneurs like Boeing were still present. This infrastructure would prove crucial in the coming global conflict. When World War II erupted in 1939, the U.S. initially remained neutral. But after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, everything changed. Seattle suddenly became a frontline city, not geographically, but industrially. The city's shipyards, which had slowed during the Depression, became crucial for the war effort. Thousands of workers, men and women, including African Americans and immigrants, flooded into the city to produce ships, planes, and equipment that would transform the Pacific Northwest forever. The Port of Seattle expanded rapidly. Shipyards like Todd and Puget Sound were retooled for military production. Boeing shifted from experimental planes to mass production of bombers like the B-17 and B-29. Seattle's war economy didn't just bring employment, it brought a demographic revolution. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. African Americans migrated from the South in search of shipyard jobs. Seattle became more diverse, reshaping its social landscape. William Boeing's company became a cornerstone of Seattle's wartime identity. During the war, Boeing produced thousands of airplanes for the U.S. Army Air Corps. The B-17 and later the B-29 became symbols of American air power. Skilled engineers, designers, and assembly workers transformed Boeing into a massive industrial complex. At its peak, Boeing employed tens of thousands of workers in Seattle alone, more than the city had during its gold rush boom.
Boeing's success didn't just propel Seattle into wartime prominence, it laid the foundation for the city's post-war aerospace dominance, which would shape the Pacific Northwest for decades. War brought growth, but it also magnified tensions. Housing shortages were severe. Schools and hospitals struggled to keep up with the booming population. Racial discrimination persisted, despite African Americans contributing crucial labor in shipyards and factories. Seattle also experienced the national fear of espionage and sabotage. Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans faced suspicion, culminating in the forced internment of thousands from the West Coast, a painful chapter in Seattle's history. Yet the city's resilience shone. Labor unions negotiated better conditions. Civic leaders coordinated housing projects. Communities adapted to rapid change, proving that Seattle could survive not just disaster, but sudden, explosive growth. Seattle's war workforce included thousands of women who took on jobs traditionally held by men. Known as Rosies of the Waterfront, they repaired ships, worked in assembly lines, and kept the city's military production humming. Their contribution transformed social norms, challenging gender roles and laying the groundwork for future movements in equality and labor rights. By 1945, Seattle had become one of the West Coast's most important industrial cities. Shipyards were producing vessels at record speed. Boeing's planes dominated the skies. Workers were plentiful, and infrastructure was stretched to the limit but holding. Seattle had faced depression, labor unrest, and social upheaval, and it had emerged as a powerhouse of production. Its economy was no longer fragile, it was essential to the nation's war effort. Yet the transformation was not without cost. Families had been uprooted. Communities had been divided by race and class. Housing shortages and social tension remained. And when the war ended, the city would have to pivot once more, from military production to peacetime industry. What happens when a city that survived fires, labor wars, and global conflict suddenly finds itself at the center of a post-war economic boom? Seattle's streets were still scarred from the Depression. Shipyards and factories had thrived during World War II. But what happens when the war ends and soldiers return home? For Seattle, the answer was reinvention. Rapid growth, suburban sprawl, new industries, and a cultural transformation that would forever reshape the city. This was a period of both glitter and tension. While skyscrapers rose and neighborhoods expanded, racial divides, housing crises, and political battles simmered beneath the surface. The 1950s and 1960s were a time of unprecedented change for Seattle. Its economy shifted from wartime production to peacetime prosperity. Boeing became a national and international powerhouse. The middle class expanded and new neighborhoods sprouted in once forested hills and reclaimed wetlands. But this boom was fragile. Decisions made in this era about highways, housing, and urban planning would leave lasting scars on the city. And yet, the energy and optimism of the post-war era propelled Seattle into its next transformation. After 1945,
thousands of veterans returned to Seattle seeking jobs, homes, and stability. The GI Bill provided loans for housing and education, fueling a surge in construction and enrollment in local universities. Suburbs grew rapidly. Communities in North Seattle, Lake Forest Park, and Bellevue expanded with single-family homes, cul-de-sacs, and tree-lined streets. The automobile became central to life, reshaping the city's geography. Here's a fact few remember. Seattle's freeway system, still under construction today, began in earnest in this era. Entire neighborhoods were bulldozed to make way for arterial roads, altering the social fabric of the city. This expansion fueled the construction industry, created new retail hubs, and contributed to an unprecedented population boom. By 1960, Seattle's population had surpassed 557,000, almost double that of 1940. Boeing, which had grown during the war, now became the engine of Seattle's post-war economy. In the late 1940s and 1950s, the company introduced the B-47 Stratojet, the B-52 Stratus Fortress, and experimental commercial planes. By the 1960s, Boeing had shifted into the commercial airliner market. The Boeing 707 became one of the first jet airliners to achieve mass commercial success. Seattle's economy was transformed. Engineers, factory workers, and ancillary industries thrived. At its peak, Boeing employed tens of thousands in the Puget Sound region. The city's skyline began to reflect this new wealth, with office buildings, hotels, and theaters rising along downtown streets. Boeing's dominance created a paradox: prosperity and dependence. The city grew wealthy, but the economy became heavily reliant on a single corporation, a fragility that would resurface in future downturns.
Economic growth also fueled cultural expansion. The Seattle Symphony, founded decades earlier, gained prominence. Museums, theaters, and art galleries flourished. New music venues hosted jazz, blues, and early rock performances, attracting talent from across the country. Education expanded too. The University of Washington grew rapidly, transforming Seattle into a center of research, innovation, and intellectual life. Did you know? The University of Washington was instrumental in early computer research in the 1950s and 1960s, laying groundwork that would help shape the region's later tech boom. Seattle's identity began shifting, from industrial powerhouse to intellectual and cultural hub. Neighborhoods like Capitol Hill, Queen Anne, and Ballard became magnets for artists, musicians, and thinkers, contributing to the city's eclectic character. Post-war reconstruction also meant massive infrastructure projects. Seattle modernized water and sewage systems, widened streets, and invested in public transit. Yet not all decisions were positive. The construction of Interstate 5 cut through neighborhoods, disproportionately impacting minority communities in areas like the Central District. This displacement created lasting economic and social divides. Housing booms often prioritized single-family homes over affordable urban units, pushing lower-income residents into peripheral neighborhoods or forcing them out entirely. Many of today's debates over gentrification, housing affordability, and urban planning trace their roots to these post-war decisions. Seattle's post-war boom was not equally shared. African Americans, who had moved to the city during wartime shipyard jobs, faced systemic discrimination in housing and employment. Redlining restricted home ownership in many neighborhoods, and segregation was often enforced by unwritten rules. These social tensions simmered beneath the surface, occasionally erupting in protests, activism, and calls for reform. Despite the wealth surrounding them, marginalized communities experienced economic and social exclusion. Seattle's growth was impressive, but it was uneven. Perhaps the defining moment of Seattle's post-war identity came in 1962 with the Century 21 Exposition, better known as the World's Fair. The fair showcased Seattle to the world, emphasizing science, technology, and the future. The iconic Space Needle was built, forever changing the skyline. Monorails, exhibition halls, and international pavilions symbolized a city looking forward, confident, innovative, and ambitious. The fair wasn't just about spectacle. It cemented Seattle's identity as a hub for aerospace, science, and forward-thinking industry. It also attracted millions of visitors, boosting the local economy and tourism. The World's Fair marked Seattle's full emergence from a frontier town into a modern city capable of hosting the world. By the mid-1960s, Seattle was unrecognizable from the logging camp of the 1850s. It had endured fires, labor unrest, depressions, and world wars. It had rebuilt, diversified, and grown culturally, socially, and economically. Yet the city's transformation came with contradictions. Prosperity coexisted with inequality. Growth brought cultural vibrancy, but also displacement. And dependence on Boeing foreshadowed future economic vulnerability. Seattle's post-war boom was both dazzling and precarious, a true Gilded Age of the Pacific Northwest. The post-war era laid the foundation for the modern Seattle we know today. Highways, suburbs, and corporate power reshaped the landscape. Cultural institutions, universities, and international events gave the city national prominence. Yet the lessons of this era endure. Growth must be balanced with equity. Prosperity can coexist with fragility. And a city's identity is always a mix of its triumphs, failures, and the stories of the people who live there. Seattle had been reborn, but the seeds of its next transformation, the technology revolution and rise of a global digital economy, were just beginning to take root.